clinical infectious disease epidemiologist and director of CAPRISA. Professor Dr. Salim Abdool Karim is on the line, no stranger to the airwaves, certainly in the last 3 years. Prof, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Some somber accounts to have to talk to, if those numbers are anything to go by.
Good evening, Songezo. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and a very good evening to all of the listeners. Yes, it's when we think about the pandemics we have been dealing with in the last few decades, we sort of immediately think about COVID-19 because of its immediacy and its impact. And when we think back to the 1980s, that HIV was in a very similar position, causing upheaval across the world because there was no treatment. In fact, initially we didn't even have a diagnosis. We didn't have a test for almost 3 years. People were dying, and we were just dealing with this impact on our society. And now, 40 years later, in the HIV pandemic, our situation is very different. We have highly effective treatment. We have a test that will tell you with 99.9% accuracy whether you have HIV or not within, 7 minutes. So the situation is now drastically different. But still, HIV continues to be a major scourge, particularly in Africa, where, you've already described how just over 2 out of every 3 people living with HIV in the world lives in Africa, and that we continue to have a situation with 1.5 million new infections. So why is that continuing? Well, partly it's continuing because, we don't have a foolproof prevention measure. We don't have a vaccine. And so we are dependent on treatment as one of the key ways in which we want to prevent HIV, and we are dependent on behavior change. So we still have a long road to go to deal with HIV.
Where did the public discourse change, Prof? I mean, you're mentioning the 80s and the 90s, and certainly in the 2000s. If my memory serves me correct, I was in Standard 8 in 2000, and the conversation was about condoms. Love Life was a leading organization in that public advocacy campaign, Soul City even. These conversations were taking place vigorously and rigorously debated in Parliament, even involving as high a level as the office of the presidency. It was thoroughly debated even in schools. These were the topics of socio-economic questions, even in curricula. And in a way, at least people were talking about it, which would have been very different. Albeit stigmatized, the conversation was there. And it has evolved. In the era of Motsoaledi, certainly in the South Africa context, there was major impetus in the rollout of ARVs. And so headway again was made there. Am I correct in saying large parts of those strides that were made 25 to 20 years ago somewhat have tapered off? Or has the conversation about other things that are a challenge to public health taken over, not necessarily at the expense of the conversations and the programs of and about HIV and AIDS? Where exactly are we at in the general conscientization of societies around the world on HIV and AIDS?
Yeah, I think when you just think back to answer the first of your questions, which is a critical one, which is, when did that change occur in the narrative? And that change occurred essentially around 2000. And the reason for that was that up to the year 2000, the world was completely divided between the rich countries that could afford treatment and the poor countries that couldn't afford treatment, where if you happened to be born in Africa, you were going to die from HIV if you got it, because we couldn't afford the treatment. But South Africa, we hosted the International AIDS Conference in July of 2000. And it was at that conference, literally at that meeting, that the narrative changed. And I remember, because I was the scientific chair of that conference, we had high hopes that President Mbeki was going to say something other than denialism. And he disappointed all of us in the opening of that conference in just reiterating his denialist ideas. But President Mandela, in his closing address, wow, what a rousing speech. I counted, because I was sitting there on the stage, that he had 17 standing ovations, and he galvanized that audience. Drug companies, academics, healthcare providers, doctors. He got everybody onto the same page. And the conference was able to move the needle in terms of getting this new narrative. We cannot accept this two-world situation. We've got to make treatment available. And so what happened shortly thereafter? The UN created the Global Fund for HIV that is providing billions of dollars a year to make treatment available. There's PEPFAR, where the U.S. government pours billions of dollars into making treatment available in Africa. You've got all of these initiatives in creating global solidarity, wealthy countries providing funds to save lives of people in Africa.
Why
so that's
are they not yielding?
That's a change.
Why are they not yielding? I mean, 2 out of 3. When we're talking about 38 million, we're talking about in excess of 24 million people here, out of 38 million from Africa. And yet, if you look at the numbers to which you've made reference in terms of influx of funds and support, if you will, it's not translating. Where is the mismatch?
I think when you think back now, if we go back to, let's say, 2010, there were well over 1.5 million deaths from HIV. In fact, closer to 2 million. So we have more than half those numbers of deaths. And that's largely driven by the rollout of ART. Mm-hmm. In terms of new infections, we had about 3.5 million new infections at that time. We're now down to about 1.5 million. So you're right, we have made progress in the last decade and a half, driven by treatment. But we haven't got to the point where we would like to be, which is, are we on the verge of eliminating this condition? Even one death from HIV is one death too many. So what is it going to take for us to get from where we are now to that point? Well, the world has a plan. That plan was put together and approved by all countries at the United Nations in 2016. Croatia and I were part and parcel of that meeting. We helped organize it. But that UN high-level declaration of on AIDS spells out what our global plan is, and that is to end AIDS as a public health threat by 2030. And the strategy and the milestones to do that are driven largely by high treatment coverage. High treatment coverage is going to get us a long way towards that, but not going to get us entirely to that point. So we're going to have to ensure we continue our prevention efforts and do better with prevention as well.
Against the statement that HIV and AIDS cannot not be seen, or at least the solutions to HIV and AIDS need to effectively be Africa-centered solutions by virtue of the fact that 2 out of 3 people come from Africa who carry this disease. Africa, though, is only less than 17% of global population. This, for me, is what is staggering, if not striking. The fact that, relative to the rest of the world, our entire continent only accounts for less than 1 out of 5 people, and yet of those who carry this deadly disease, we are 2 out of 3. The strides that have been made are noted. Yes, of course it is important to reflect positively where positive reflection is required. But then beyond that layer, when you really get to the core facts, the hard facts, 1 out of 5 people in the world, less than 1 out of 5 people are African. and yet HIV and AIDS represents 2 out of 3 in the world. That is something which should at least be back-jolting. Not so?
Yeah, I mean, it's a situation that, reflects the challenges we face in Africa, not just from HIV, but also from TB and malaria and so on. We've got to do better. We've got to do better in terms of ensuring we have healthcare services that can reach every single person. Because what's holding us back in Africa? Why aren't we doing better in preventing HIV? Well, the principal challenge we have is that we've got to have more people testing. Because once you test and you are positive, we can put you onto treatment. Once you're on treatment, on ART, then you don't spread the virus. So we can't stop people spreading the virus unless they know they have it. And that's where the big challenge comes. So we have done quite well in most countries in Africa in testing women. And the reason for that revolves largely that women come into healthcare services when they are pregnant or when they are coming in for contraception. So at that point, they are always tested. So we have high testing coverage in women, not so with men. Men have remained a major challenge because they interact with our healthcare system so rarely. So because they don't come into the healthcare service, unless, they're really ill, but they're not coming in, giving us an opportunity to test them, that means that they have to volunteer and come into the healthcare services just for a test, and they don't do that. So we have to change that narrative. And that's all about promoting testing, creating new opportunities to test young men, particularly in a situation at work, in occupational health settings, in shebeens, and so on. So we have to think a bit more creatively. How do we reach a group that won't come into the healthcare service and have a test? As soon as they have a test and they're positive, we put them on treatment. So that stops them from spreading the virus. How to get them to test.
Would the stigma attached to it still be as prevalent now as it might have been some 20, 25 years ago? I'm really referring to this point that you raised, that men generally would not be healthcare users, especially pronounced if, for instance, stigma is part and parcel of what ultimately brings us to this point, the quadruple burden of disease, HIV and tuberculosis being number 1, chronic illness and mental illness 2, injury, violence 3, mental, neonatal and child mortality 4. But if we're talking as a nation about a quadruple burden of disease, and HIV and AIDS features prominently there, is one not minded to suggest that, as we have seen how government can arrange her resources to respond to COVID-19, and we've got all the IPO of the last 3 years and the memory is fresh, to respond similarly to HIV and AIDS, more especially when it forms part of the quartet of burdens of disease in this country?
When we wrote the articles in the Lancet series, that was some 5 years ago now, and we coined that phrase. In that article, I used the word the quadruple burden of disease, and we talked about these 4 elements that comprise the burden of disease. At that point, HIV was our number 1 challenge. Today, HIV is not the number 1 challenge in the same way because of treatment. It's still in the top 3, but TB has become our number 1 challenge. So that it has become less of a concern or less of a burden is a reflection of time. That with time, we've become somewhat complacent. We talk less about HIV. We're a bit tired of HIV, actually. And so what happened was that people moved on. They gave it less attention. And part of giving it less attention was that we then continue the fight against the stigma that's associated with it. Now, much of that stigma is dealt with. So, because there are so many people now living openly with HIV. But there is still that remaining stigma and the shame that people feel when they test and they test positive. We have to change that in our society, and it's not easy to change. That takes a whole lot of time and effort for it to become a normalized part of society. You got HIV, so what? It's like you got a headache, so what? We got to get to that point, because without that, people will be reticent to talk about it. They'll be reticent to test, and they'll be reticent to change their behavior.
Let me test that right now, the reticence or ideally lack of. Producer Lesego says, please ask listeners to call in and help us understand why HIV is still the leading killer in Africa. Let's ask for voice notes, let's ask for calls, let's get voice notes, let's get calls, let's get text messages. Let's get those who are living with HIV and AIDS. And you don't have to give us the name, but I think to take care of what's that word, man? To take care of the stigma. Your name, therefore, becomes that much more important. Put a name to this thing. And so hopefully as a society we can crush the stigma that is unnecessarily attached to it. Living with HIV and AIDS, your experience, how you're coping, how especially the question of stigma remains a high aspect of the agenda of dealing with and in HIV and AIDS. We really would like to take your calls on that. 086 000 2032. Send us a voice note, please. 0614 104 107. My guest this evening is Professor Salim Abdool Karim, clinical infectious disease epidemiologist and director of CAPRISA. Prof, we have the numbers. They are clear. What lies hidden is the amount of strides made globally. The South Africa question is more nuanced, as many other nations have nuances to themselves. If, and perhaps this might be prophetic, you can own it if you will, if you are given the position of policy custodian, as the Minister of Health is given, together with the large chunk of our budget, which is a primary department, health, education, and social development, in really healing a nation and making a nation healthy, upon which everything else can be built, what would you advance as your top priority areas to arrest the numbers in public health as we see, which against our resources and availability of skills and the goodwill that is out there, serious inroads could be made if we just prioritize and indeed distributed and configured our resources better?
Well, that's a tall order, but let's see.
I suspect it is.
So when I think back, we've got essentially to deal with four things. The first is that we've got to ensure that we continue our efforts in schools to make sure that every child that's coming out of school, knows about HIV, knows how it spreads, know that there's a test available, and knows about condoms and so on. So I think at a very fundamental level, we need an informed public. We need an informed community. So that's the first thing. And I think we do reasonably well on that front. Maybe just a bit of upgrading in the curriculum, but that's really what it's about. But I think that one of the elements that needs to be included in there is gender-based violence, because gender-based violence is one of the important ways in which people are spreading the virus without, not by mutual consensual sex, but through this kind of situation. So I would certainly include that. As far as the second thing I would do, I would think about how is it that what can we do to get every male, under the age of 35 to have a test regularly? What would it take to do that? Can we provide an incentive to do that? Can we appeal to their better judgment to say, here's something you need to do for your health. Come in once a year, have a test for HIV, measure your blood pressure, check if you've got diabetes. We do a checkup. And that not only helps us in HIV, it's screening for tuberculosis, it's screening for all the important diseases like hypertension and so on. Because these are all common conditions. They're all part of the quadruple burden of disease.
Mm-hmm.
The third thing I would do is ensure that our HIV services are maintaining people on treatment. We do not want people who are on treatment defaulting. Because the moment they default, it leads to two problems. It leads to drug resistance, because now they stop their treatment, and they then become now infectious and start spreading the virus. So our health service has to follow up and make sure any person defaulting is followed up. And then the last is, I think you just got to continue our efforts, ranging from research to community education to ensuring that we're putting in the effort to contribute not just in South Africa but at a global level to help fight HIV in all its different dimensions. So there's that global element that we have to contribute as well.
Interesting thoughts. A lot of community-based advocacy seems to be an overriding theme in some of what you have said. Shall I take a couple of calls, please, Prof, with your indulgence? I know time is running out because Babu Ngonde is too slow out of the proverbial starting blocks, but certainly great to have him as a caller. Babu Ngonde is based in Cape Town now, no longer at Gqeberha, and we go after that to Mafikeng with Mbowana. If I've mispronounced the name, Data, please correct me there, Mbowana. Babu Ngonde.
Khadebe, Bungani.
Bautok.
I'll be right onto it. So as you well know, that in 79 and 80, I was in the States.
Yes, you were.
Relevant for this topic. The students in my class and in the surroundings would always say, did he use protection? I had no idea what that was. I was to know what they were talking about only when I was in South Africa in the early 90s. They actually meant condom, right? They don't say condom there, but they will use the word protection. Anyway, in 92, I was with an actuary again in the company that we used to work for. He said to me, this will be a pandemic. It's not in the news now, but in our research as actuaries, in a province called Natal, right, women who were coming from maternity leave, prenatal clinics, have their blood checked. There was this thing called HIV. Not well known that time, but now it is. Anyway, the question to the professor is, it would appear to me, right, that HIV is a, shall I say, a black disease, right? Although not quite, because there are some white folks as well. I'm saying that because there doesn't seem to be enough vigor, effort, oomph, right, that we have seen in 2020 when this thing of COVID came along, right? All the Western countries with lots of money, they invested a lot in COVID. Lastly, in the regimen of HIV treatment, I did a course some time ago. There are 3 pills at that time. One called Centrobin, and Endracitabine, Efifarens, and so forth, and Tinovivor. Now, I understand that one of those pills, I think is called Efifarens, when you use it, is very good in reducing the viral load. But the negative effect of that pill, I'm not sure if the HIV patients were told about this, it tends to make you, shall I say, hallucinate, almost close to the point of being mad, to put it bluntly. Can the professor please square the circles for me? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Babu Ngonde. Intriguing question. 21:39 is the time. Mbowana Mafikeng, please correct my surname, my pronunciation of your name. Confirm otherwise.
Good evening.
Indeed. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Yeah, it's correct.
Thank you so much. Your question for Prof, please.
Yes, my question for Prof is like, since 3 2 out of 3 people with HIV in Africa, as you see. And we are now seeing some videos which is saying there's a certain group of people spreading HIV in Africa. Is that deniable? Secondly, we're hearing that prostitutes are going to have a right to have whatever business with a situation of HIV like this. Is that possible? That is my 2 questions I want to hear from you.
Prof, did you get those 2 questions from this recent caller?
I think I got the question.
Sure.
So shall we deal with the first question?
Let's.
All right. So I think, there's a tendency to ascribe HIV to being a black disease or a gay disease and so on. The actual global statistics indicate that none of that is accurate. And we should avoid it anyway from a point of view of avoiding stigmatizing it or racializing it. But if you look at a global level, in the gay community, in the heterosexual community, HIV is in both those. It affects white people, Indian people, African people across the board. The rates are slightly different, but that a lot of that relates to migrant labor. So migrant labor, which destroyed family life originally, and HIV was spreading rapidly in the hostels that were occurring around the mines, and that was described back in the 1980s. So we should we can really talk about it being a global disease affecting everybody. Now, your caller specifically asked about efavirenz. So efavirenz was one of the key drugs that we used to use to treat this disease. We stopped using efavirenz quite a while ago. We now use a combination of a form of tenofovir together with emtricitabine, and we use a drug called dolutegravir. Now, efavirenz, when it was being used, had some mild hallucinogenic, hallucinogenic properties. In other words, it made you a bit high. And it was often being sold when HIV patients were collecting the medication. They could sell the efavirenz to those who were making wunga, because efavirenz was being put into the wunga as part and parcel of making people high. But that problem is gone now. Well, for the last 2-3 years, we've not used efavirenz. And so we focus now on a new drug. And now you can't do that anymore anyway, because we only use one tablet. So now we don't have separate tablets for efavirenz and for each of these drugs. It's one tablet. So the new tablet that people take is one tablet every day, and it contains all 3 of the medications. None of them are hallucinogenic. So that's resolved that problem when it did occur. The second caller asked the question about, here's these education programs, but, HIV is still spreading. Who is spreading it? So this has been described quite well in much of southern and eastern Africa. So in southern and eastern Africa, that occurs for about half of the global pandemic. So the rest of Africa contributes the rest. That makes it 2/3, or just over 2/3. So when you think about why is it that this particular region of Africa has so much of HIV, it's being driven by what is called the cycle of HIV transmission. Now, what is that cycle? Young girls, teenagers, or in their early 20s, have the highest rates of HIV. So they get infected, and when they get infected and they reach the age of around 30, 35, that's when a very high proportion of women have HIV. So when they are now trying to find their partners who are of the same age, so men and women in their 30s who are trying to settle down, what happens is that these men acquire HIV from their female partners. But when they acquire HIV, about 40% or so in the studies that have been reporting it are also having sex with a teenage girl. And so when they get HIV, they then pass it on to the next generation. They're passing it on to these teenage girls. So the main factor driving this pandemic in Southern Africa is what we refer to as age disparate sex. It's when teenage girls and young girls are having sex with men in their 30s. That difference, which is on average 8 to 10 years, is driving this pandemic. Because when you look at the situation, if you take teenage girls and teenage boys, teenage girls have about 4 times more HIV than teenage boys. So the girls are acquiring HIV from having sex with these older men. That's part and parcel of who is spreading the virus to who. And that's been shown now phylogenetically by using the gene sequences of the virus. So it's not just described through behavior, but described through biological evidence.
Prof, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, can you hear me?
No, we have. I just thought it was a bit of an abrupt end, but unfortunately I have to let this one go because you've raised quite a few issues that unfortunately time doesn't allow me to probe, but those questions certainly were important to get a better sense, perhaps even of the science associated with it. But I think there can be no moving away from this. A lot of what we are dealing with is behavior-based. And the solution similarly is in behavior, especially behavior among men. Would that be a fair parting shot?
I think you've hit it on the head. I don't want to blame men because it takes 2 people to have sex. Just as much as we have a situation of young girls with old men, it's also, we shouldn't assign blame. We've got to deal with it in its totality. We've got to find ways to protect young girls and also to test young men.
We'll try our best to have these conversations with the hope that in the greater enterprise, they lend credence to the work that you and your colleagues in the field certainly do. For your time and more, thanks, Prof. Much appreciated.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Professor Salim Abdool Karim. Well, you all know about him. You've seen him quite a lot in the